games of world champions. 5 are randomly picked up, and those 5 games, Raghav will play the game in the forward direction, blindfolded and without taking any support. He will be playing 5 world record games, games of world champions, in the forward direction, blindfolded without taking any support. So I'll be first announcing the game 1 that has been picked up out of 5. The first one is Vishwanathan Anand versus Nino Kirill. The Anand Vishwanathan versus Nino Kirill. This game, Raghav is now going to play blindfolded in the forward direction without any support. You can also watch the moves on your right side screen. The the entire game will be projected, so you can track the game as Raghav plays. And on the right side, you can on the
You can please start, Raghav.
E2, E4, C7, C5, knight G1, F3, E7, E6, D2, D4, C5 into D4, knight F3 into D4, A7, A6, bishop F1, D3, bishop F8, C5, knight D4, B3, bishop C5, A7, knight B1, C3, knight B8, C6, Queen D1, E2, D7, D6, Bishop C1, E3, Bishop A7 into E3, Queen E2 into E3, Knight G8, F6, G2, G4, D7, B5, white long castle, short castle, B5, B4,
Movement please. White plate.
G4, G5, knight F6, E8, F2, F4, B5, B4, knight C3, E2, A6, A5, knight B3, D4, knight C6 into D4, knight E2 into D4, Queen D8, B6, E4, E5, Bishop C8, B7, Rook H1, F1, D6 into E5, F4 into E5, Rook A8, D8, Bishop D3 into H7 check, King G8 into H7, G5, G6 check, King H7, G8, Queen E3, H3, Knight E8, F6, E5 into F6, G7 into F6, G6, G7, and black lines.
Wonderful. That was good.
Can I submit this?
In the secondary card, the first game has been played, and now the second game. It's Karpo Anatoly versus Topalo.
Good luck if you start.
Knight G1, F3, F7, F5, D2, D4, Knight G8, F6, Bishop C1, G5, E7, E6, Knight B1, D2, Bishop F8, E7, Bishop G5 into F6, Bishop E7 into F6, E2, E4, short castle, Bishop F1, D3, G7, G6, Queen D1, E2, Bishop F6, G7, C2, C3, Knight B8, C6, long castle, D7, D5, E4, E5, B7, B6, H2, H4, H7, H6, Rook D1, G1, Knight C6, E7, G2, G4, F5, F4, H4, H5, G6, G5, Knight F3 into G5, H6 into G5, Knight D2, F3, C7, C5.
We need to after H into G5, can you go back to Knight F3 into G5, H6 into G5?
H5 H6, Bishop G7, H8, Knight D2, F3, C7, C5, Knight F3 into G5, C5 into D4, Bishop D3, H7, checkmate.
Wonderful, that was wonderful. So please have some water, please have some rest before we tell you which is going to be the next game. We can get the pieces set. You need not set it yourself. Yes, sir, please remove. Relax a little. You can see that the blindfolded chess is not limited only to blindfolded understanding of the moves, but he even has a geographical understanding of the board and he can set the pieces. I think blindfolded we think only from one angle, that is we close the eyes and think of a move, but here he is able to place the pieces as well, and that is something I think it's wonderful, because although it's a small board of 1.5 by 1.5, it still requires not only understanding of chess but also geographical understanding.
Carbo Anatoly versus Niadek Wojcik.
We are ready for the Carpo-Gniatic game. Please maintain complete silence. I request all of you to maintain complete silence. Raghav, please start when you feel like. You are ready?
Yeah.
Yes, Raghav is ready for the third game, Carpo-Gniatic. Please maintain silence. Please start, Raghav.
E2, E4, E7, E5, Knight G1, F3, Knight B8, C6, Bishop F1, B5, Knight G8, F6, short castle, Knight F6 into E4, D2, D4, Knight C6 into D4, Knight F3 into D4, E5 into D4, Rook F1, E1, Queen D8, H4, G2, G3, Queen H4, F6, Rook E1 into E4 check, Bishop F8, E7, Queen D1 into D4, Queen F6, F5. Knight B1, C3, C7, C6. Bishop B5, D3. Queen F5, H3. Queen D4 into G7. Rook H8, F8. Bishop C1, H6. King E8, D8. Rook E4 into E7. King D8 into E7. Queen G7 into F8 check. King E6, E7, F6. Bishop H6, D7 check. King F6, F7, F6, G5. Queen F8, E7 check. King G5, H5. Queen E7 into F7 check. King H5, G4. Queen F7, F4 check. King G4, H5. Knight C3, E4. King H5, G6. Queen F4, F6 check. King G6, H5. Queen F6, G5 checkmate.
Very well done. The game is over. Black king has been checkmated. Very well done. Yes, okay. Please.
Can I start?
Yes, please start.
D2, D4, Knight C8, F6, C2, C4, G7, G6, Knight B1, C3, D7, D5, Knight G1, F3, Bishop F8, G7, Queen D1, B3, G7, G6, sorry I repeat,
Yes.
C7, C6,
Yes.
C4 into D5, Knight F6 into D5, E2, E4, Knight D5, B6, Bishop C1, F4, short castle, Rook A1, D1, Bishop C8, G4, Bishop F4, E3, Bishop G4 into F3, G2 into F3, E7, E6, H2, H4, H7, H5, A2, A4, Queen D8, C7, F3, F4, Knight B8, D7, F4, F5, E6 into F5, E4 into F5, King G8, H7, Bishop F1, D3, Rook A8, E8, King E1, D2, Queen C7, D6, Rook H1, G1, Bishop G7 into D4, F5 into G6 step, F7 into G6, Rook G1 into G6, Bishop D4 into E3 check, King D2, C2, Rook F8 into F2 check, King C2, B1, Queen D6, B8, Rook D1, G1, Knight D7, E5, Rook G6, G7 check, Black resigns.
Black resigns because of the coming mate on the next move. As you can see, Black is done this game. Very well done. Congratulations. Let's come to the. Are you ready to play the next game as well, or you need some rest? Ready? Good.
Okay, the next game, the last game in this record 2 is Anand Vishwanathan versus Ehrenberg Sergi. It is Anand Vishwanathan versus Ehrenberg Sergi.
Please start. Whenever you feel it, whenever you are comfortable. Yes, please start. I request the audience to keep quiet, please. Switch off the mobile phones. Please start.
D2, D4, D7, D5, C2, C4, C7, C6, Knight G1, F3, Knight G8, F6, Knight B1, C3, E7, E6, Bishop C1, G5, D5 into C4.
Can we go one more back? Just Bishop G5. Bishop C1, G5.
Before this move,
Yeah, before D into C4. Can we after Bishop G5?
D5 into C4. after bishop c1 g5.
Perhaps you can go back, start the game from the beginning, please. Please maintain silence.
d2, d4, d7, d5, c2, c4, c7, c6, knight g1, f3, knight g8, f6, knight b1, c3, e7, e6, bishop c1, g5, d5 into c4.
At this stage, perhaps you can go back just one more lesson. Think of just relax. Think for some time. Here, black has played different move before that move. So perhaps, yes, black plays h7, h6 here.
h7, h6,
Very good.
bishop g5, h4, d5 into c4,
Very good.
b2, e4, g7, g5, bishop h4, g3, b7, b5, bishop f1, e2, bishop c8, b7, knight f3, e5, h6, h5, h2, h3, knight b8, d7, short castle, g5, g4, h3 into g4, h5 into g4, knight e5 into g4, b5, b4, e4, e5.
Just a minute, please. You can take more time if you so feel.
Knight d4 into f6.
Very good, wonderful. Yes.
Knight d7 into f6. e4, e5, b4 into c3, e5 into f6, c3 into b2, rook a1, b1, queen d8 into f6, bishop g3, e5, queen f6, h6, bishop e5 into h8, queen h6 into h8, rook b1 into b2, long castle, queen d1, b1.
Now he needs a break. I think he needs some place to rest. The 5 games are finished. Now I hand over to Mr. Raghav. Raghav's dad will be here. I request Mr. Murthy from Limca Records to address the audience.
Well, he has already done 2 records, so the congratulations to him. We will be doing in fact, we would like to present him a certificate every game he finishes successfully. Unfortunately, we couldn't bring it due to our printer is not working. We will have this send it on Monday or Tuesday to his father, and you can display them wherever he wants to. But it has been successfully done, and I am sure that he will complete the other 3 also, and he will be the only kid to have in the record for this completion of 5 records.